Hi, everyone. I'm the director for our New Zealand registered not-for-profit called Common Knowledge. We intentionally named this trust Common Knowledge because there are things that we all share together as human beings. We all blink, we all cough, we can all tighten up our muscles, and we all breathe in our nose and out our nose, or in our nose, out our mouth, or in our mouth, out our nose, or in or out our mouth. And I read a post on one of the long haul COVID groups about somebody who had posted that they had a really great day because their oximeter showed that they had 100% oxygen saturation. And everybody praised them. And I thought, this is such a wrong picture. And if it's a wrong picture with people with COVID long haul symptoms, and that's what people think they should be achieving, then what exactly are they achieving? And how does it live within their lives? What does it mean for somebody who says, I have something on my finger, I have 100% oxygen? What does that mean? And that's where common knowledge comes in. I chose 50 years ago not to learn anything medical. I'm what's called a trivia researcher, and you can say, oh, well, we're not going to listen to her. My job, particularly around pregnancy and childbirth, was to translate information into common knowledge. So if a pregnant woman came and saw me and said, I saw my midwife or my doctor and my baby is a +1 station and I'm 60% effaced and 1 centimeter dilated, I'd ask her, what does that mean? What does that feel like? What's that information giving you? And women would go, I don't know. Well, if we don't know, then that's just information. So what's happening when you put an oximeter on your finger and it says 100% oxygen or 82% oxygen? What's that mean? So right away you're going to go, well, if I have 100% oxygen, that's good. If I have 82% oxygen, that's bad. And that's the complexity of what's called the yes and the no. So should you have 100% oxygen in your body? Is that normal? Is that preferable? And how does that exhibit itself in your life? I mean, honestly, you'd think that if you had 100% oxygen in your life, you'd never feel breathless. Is that true? Well, no. If you have 82% oxygen in your life, in your blood, does that mean you're dying or dead or incredibly breathless? Not necessarily. And this is what I want to explain to you. I'm a Buteyko instructor. That's a type of breathing. There's a doctor by the name of Buteyko who worked with all sorts of people who were breathless, whether it was asthma, COPD, emphysema, snoring, sleep apnea, mouth breathing, all of that. And I'm also an Oxygen Advantage instructor, which comes from Buteyko and is a modification of those skills, but it's a simulation of high altitude breath training for people who are not breathless and are athletes who want to improve their athletic performance. And what does this have to do with you? A lot. Many of COVID long haul people who are experiencing breathlessness probably had breathlessness before they got COVID. Didn't even notice it. Didn't even think they were. Very much like me, but probably a bit different. I was a nose-nose belly breather for 50 years. And when I started to study Buteyko, I realized all of my breathing was dysfunctional. I was breathing too fast unnecessarily. But how could I change that? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So some of this was so scientific for me that I, as a person who has phantasia, I have no visual memory. It's very hard for me to read things. I chose not to be scientific because I thought that would confuse people. They should go to an appropriately trained, skilled, if licensed person who can explain this scientifically. If you want common knowledge, I'm going to explain this to you. So we have a breathing center in our brain back here. If you get knocked out, if I get knocked out and I stop breathing, I have enough oxygen in my system that I will not suffer brain damage for 4 to 5 minutes. How are you doing with your breathing compared to that? Can you hold your breath for 4 to 5 minutes? I can't. Free divers do. So what's happening to them when they're free diving? Or what about if you have children? Is that the same for children? No, it's not actually, because I got involved in pregnancy and childbirth. Turns out that babies in utero have 2 oxygen molecules attaching to a hemoglobin. That's called fetal hemoglobin, whereas we have adult hemoglobin, which attaches 1 oxygen to a red blood cell. And that's what this oximeter is picking up. We have a high saturation of oxygen, and each oxygen thing is attached to a red blood cell. Doesn't mean there are 100 red blood cells and they all have oxygen. That I don't know about. But babies, when they're born, shift from 2 oxygen molecules attached to a red blood cell to 1. But they can go 15 to 20 minutes without breathing, without suffering brain damage. Could you? No, because we're adults, so we can only go 4 to 5 minutes. But that should give us a clue that if we're feeling breathless, something isn't okay. So a person who's putting an oximeter on them and says, I have 100% oxygen in my bloodstream, you shouldn't be feeling breathless at all. You should be able to go out and run a marathon and not be breathless at the end of that. If 100% oxygen in your blood is good and right and preferable and ideal and the goal, then your problem should be solved. You should be feeling great. And that's not accurate. So we have a disconnect between information and what's happening in our body. And for me, as the director of Common Knowledge Trust, what was important was that we had to be able to be applicable to us. We had to be able to use it and understand how we were using it and working with it. We believe as a trust, our mission statement is we should use any and all healthcare systems that we want without prejudice or judgment. So if you're going to a pulmonologist or a doctor, a cardiologist or a therapist, and they are talking to you because you had severe COVID or acute COVID, like I did, and we were breathless, we had oppression in our chest. This originally was considered to be a respiratory disease, and our blood oxygen stats were important to us because most of us didn't have this other thing. So remember when I went back and said at the beginning, if you had 82% on this, was that bad? Well, not necessarily, because the simulation of high altitude breath training produces that. It produces a low oxygen saturation in your blood because we are trained then to have a high carbon dioxide tolerance, to which most of you have never heard of that. I had never heard of it. And it has a name. It's a dissociation curve, oxygen dissociation curve. There's actually a link in the description, well beyond my capacity to read and understand the words. And just Google it. I just picked one. There are lots of them. And what do we know in terms of common knowledge about this? And we can go, oh, yes. Some of us may be my age or close to my age. You may know the Olympics. Most of us know the Olympics. Did you know that when the Kenyan runners from Kenya and Africa, who live at high altitude, started to run in the Olympics, they left everybody behind in running? They still do. Because when you live at high altitude, and we've all heard this, altitude sickness. A person who lives at a low level where there's more oxygen, goes up to a higher altitude, and they get sick because the oxygen level up there is less, and their body has not adjusted to less oxygen. But you're not just adjusting to less oxygen because that seems scary. You are actually developing what's called a carbon dioxide tolerance. How do you know you have one? A free diver has a very high carbon dioxide tolerance. And what does that mean? It means this disassociation curve. And this is for me to explain it to you simply. When you are measuring this, you are measuring the amount of oxygen that's floating around in your bloodstream. But the bloodstream isn't where oxygen is used. So when you have a high carbon dioxide tolerance, it disassociates, or it breaks apart that link, that bond between the oxygen and the red blood cells. And what does it do with the oxygen? It sends it out into your tissues and your organs to be able to be used. How do we know this? For anybody who's an athlete who runs or skis or bicycles or swims, and you do not get breathless, when you are putting your body into higher metabolic need, that means that you have a good CO2 tolerance, which means your body will more easily disassociate the oxygen from your red blood cells and send it out into your tissues. Open up your alveoli in your lungs, send it out into 100,000 miles of blood vessels, including your heart and your brain, and you don't get fatigued. You don't get lactic acid buildup. So if you have a good carbon dioxide tolerance, you can go faster, further, longer, and not be fatigued. Breathlessness is that you get fatigued and breathless as soon as you change metabolic need. But most of us don't understand what metabolic need is. I certainly didn't. Right? So if you're lying down, you have very little metabolic need. So why should you be breathless if you are lying down? But many people with COVID are breathless lying down. They may have very high oxygen in their blood, but their system is not utilizing that oxygen well. It's not feeding our tissues, our organs, our lungs, and our brain. Then if we sit up, we've increased the metabolic need because we've become slightly weight-bearing. If we stand up, our metabolic need's higher. If we start to walk, our metabolic need's higher. If we start to run, it's higher. Or bike, or climb up, or swim. So as we move faster in space, our metabolic need is increasing. Our need to use oxygen increases. If we do not have good CO2 tolerance, our body doesn't break away the oxygen and send it out to our organs and our tissues, and we feel breathless. So when you are breathless with COVID, when they first started to say this is a respiratory disease, they thought, okay, when you get over it, you're going to be better. And I was doing research in January and February of 2020, so I was following everything that I could. So then around May, they started to talk about this might be a blood vessel disease. How did they know that? Because they were doing autopsies, and they could see these micro blood clots in some people, and others this white filament in their lungs. And they started going, oh, we have a thing. It's a thing. We don't know much about it. And so that's sort of a unique thing, micro blood clots, white filaments. But it causes us to be breathless. It damages our lungs if we have that in our lungs. And it can damage our heart. And there are people who sadly have strokes or heart attacks after they recover from COVID because of these micro blood clots. They have aneurysms. But if a person has asthma, they have lung damage. If they have COPD, they have lung damage. If they have emphysema, they have lung damage. If they smoke, they have lung damage. So having lung damage does not stop anybody from improving or reducing their breathlessness. But they need to learn skills to increase their carbon dioxide tolerance, which breaks away that oxygen from their blood, from their red blood cells, and distributes it. And it opens up the alveoli, which then brings us to what is actually happening in a bigger term. So recently, there's been a lot of information, and a lot of you are experiencing this from what I read, is that they believe that this is an autonomic nervous system disorder. That's a fancy word for the sympathetic nervous system. And I've been a naturopath for 50 years. The modern world has gotten faster and faster and faster since the 70s, 80s, 90s. Then we went online. A large number of you, I would suspect, were very busy modern people. You worked, you had kids, you exercised, you did lots of things, you were online lots, you had lots going on, you were juggling lots of balls, you felt stressed, you knew you were stressed, you may have had some physical things as well, and you were just going like this all the time, like this all the time, like this all the time. And then you got COVID. And then suddenly this new virus entered into our body, and our body didn't know what to do with it. And so our physiological autoimmune system, that we just was going like this and didn't have any understanding of what this meant, our body's immune system went into hyperdrive. And it doesn't necessarily know how to shut down or shut off. So when we are living in our sympathetic nervous system, which I used to, you think that the word sympathetic meant relaxed and good, but it doesn't. It means fright. How many of you feel frightened or anxious? That's sympathetic nervous system. And that's compared to calm. That's the parasympathetic nervous system. How many of you feel flight, that you're trying to get out of this? You're trying to get it to get better. Why can't they fix it? You know, I just despair. This is just, I have good moments and I have terrible moments and I just can't stand it anymore. That's fright, flight, fight, freeze. So many of the postings in the COVID groups I'm following, sympathetic nervous system. People have all the symptoms of an elevated sympathetic nervous system, and the medical profession is beginning to recognize this as an autonomic nervous system disorder. So this is where common knowledge is really important. The medical profession, which our trust says, do anything you want. We don't care. We have no judgment, okay? The medical profession is siloed. You know that, I know that. That's not wrong. That's just how they do it, right? So you go to an auto mechanic to fix your car. You go to an auto body worker to repair the body of your car. Medical profession's the same way. If you go into a therapist, they're dealing with your psychology. If you're in the sympathetic nervous system, they see you as anxious, right? You can't calm down. You're jittery. You're anxious. Right? So they give you something to calm you down. If you're having heart palpitations as well, they may say, go to a cardiologist. So the cardiologist says, well, those heart palpitations aren't going to kill you, because there are many heart palpitations that are not going to kill you. That elevated heart rate is not going to kill you. But we can tell, your heart's stressed, you're feeling stressed, you feel terrible, you can't stand that skipping in your heart. It's terrible. We're going to give you something. They give you something that calms down, lowers your heart rate, calms you down. These medications, whether it's from the psychologist or from the cardiologist, they're all doing the same thing in a broad general sense of the word. They're calming down that sympathetic nervous system so that you can experience more calm. When you have siloed professions, and this is not wrong, There's no judgment about it. You need to understand, that your mind, your emotions, and your body are you. You are not siloed. If your body is unwell, your emotions know that, and your mind knows that. If your emotions are not well, your mind responds to that, and your body responds to that. If you're having bad thoughts, your emotions respond to that, and your body responds to that. We are just us, this one thing, our mind, our body, and our emotions. And other people feel we have a higher something, something, something. Our trust doesn't get into that. Okay, we know that if our body has COVID, that our physiological immune system got activated. And we feel that in our emotions and our body. We want our body to get fixed. In order to get fixed, we can use our mind using skills like Buteco, that are skills that help us reset the breathing center in our brain so that we activate the parasympathetic nervous system and develop a higher CO2 tolerance, and also produce and distribute another gas called nitric oxide. Most of us have never heard of it. I had never heard of it, but all of us experience it. We just don't experience it around breathing. It turns out there's a wonderful BBC program called Trust Me, I'm Your Doctor. And in one of the episodes, they were talking about skin cancer. And they went to a researcher who had a human skin and exposed it to sunlight. And he said to the doctor who was interviewing him, "See that bright light under the skin? That's the sun producing nitric oxide." I'd never heard of it. That nitric oxide is the great vasodilator. It dilates our 100,000 miles of blood vessels and the alveoli of our lungs and the blood vessels in our heart. Because when we are in the sympathetic, the flight, flight, or freeze mode, 50% of the blood and oxygen get shut down from our brain. Could that cause some of your brain fog? May not be all of it. Some of your brain fog may become just because you recognize your body still has toxicity from this virus. Either the metabolic waste of the virus, which isn't flushing out of your system yet, or if this is a blood vessel disease, we can be perhaps left with damage to the endothelial cells that line the arteries. We don't know much about that. I know heaps about it because I actually have a genetic metabolic disorder. I have a high level of homocysteine, which is a stress hormone, because I can't metabolize B vitamins. And that damages the endothelial cells of the artery. And I had blocked arteries, not because of diet or because I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't drink coffee. I've lived a very, very well-considered life for 77 years. But I have a genetic metabolic disorder. Not everybody has that. But if this disease, COVID, damages the endothelial cells, then we need to repair it. And for me, part of the repairing it was getting my body to have less physiological stress in it. I could help my body do that through certain things that I could take in terms of specific B vitamins, but I also could do that by using breathing techniques to activate my parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is our calm. And when we feel calm and our cardiovascular system is open, and when we develop a good carbon dioxide tolerance, and our oxygen is used by our tissues and our organs better, including our brain, our heart, and our lungs, and when we can produce and distribute nitric oxide by intention, we feel calmer. And when we feel calmer and our body is calmer, our body is in repair mode. So how do we know we feel nitric oxide? Because when we go out into the sun, we get sleepy. And we get sleepy, that is our parasympathetic nervous system being activated. And when our parasympathetic nervous system is activated and our blood vessels open up throughout our body, we want our oxygen to be circulating out there, not just in our bloodstream, because our bloodstream doesn't feed our organs and our tissues. It does in some ways, but the oxygen has to get out of the bloodstream. That's the oxygen dissociation curve. And we can improve our carbon dioxide tolerance. Let's go all the way back at the beginning of the conversation when I said, is 100% saturation good and 82% bad? Let's look at the 82%. Oxygen Advantage, which is a set of skills that come from Buteco, are simulating, means you don't have to live up at high altitude, simulating high altitude breath training. It is lowering the oxygen in your blood system as though you were living at a higher altitude where you had less oxygen in the air around you. And by working on those skills, you reset your breathing center in your brain so that you can tolerate more carbon dioxide. So people who have a high carbon dioxide tolerance have a low oxygen saturation. And athletes are looking for a low oxygen saturation because it tells them that their high carbon dioxide tolerance is effectively sending their oxygen into their organs and tissues and using it well. And so, what does this all mean? It all means that people who are breathless do not have a good ability to produce nitric oxide and distribute it through their body, nor do they have a good ability to tolerate carbon dioxide in their body that makes them feel breathless. So a person with asthma will say, gasp for air, because they feel they need more oxygen. But if you put an oximeter on them, their oxygen stats are 97%. They don't need more oxygen. They need a higher tolerance to CO2 so that the oxygen in their body is distributed better and used better. But this isn't something that yet that the general medical profession is working with. That's okay. Psychologists aren't working with it. Pulmonologists aren't. COVID, they're beginning to understand it. When I started to research COVID in China and in Asia, everybody was lying on their back and being intubated. Sometime around March, May, around May, somebody realized, oh, when you're lying on your back for a long period of time, you're compressing your lungs. So they flipped everybody over onto their belly, and their oxygen stats went up. It's not that you want good oxygen stats. You don't want to feel breathless. You can have very low oxygen, as athletes can have, and they're not breathless because they're using their oxygen better. So what's breathless mean? I was a nose breather, a belly breather. That's considered to be the most efficient way to breathe, the way that stimulates and activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the way that grows and produces and distributes nitric oxide. But when I counted my breaths per minute, I was breathing 12 to 20 times a minute, which seems normal. That is normal. It's a normal range. I was breathing about 20, lying down. So when I stood up, when I walked, when I moved, I was breathing faster and deeper, partly because I believed it was normal and natural and physiological that as I moved faster in space, when I ran or I bicycled or I swam, that I should breathe deeper and fuller. And yet, when I did the Buteco skills and understood that I wanted to develop greater carbon dioxide tolerance, produce and distribute nitric oxide, the number of breaths per minute dropped down significantly. So a person who is not breathless is breathing between 6 and 12 breaths a minute. And a person who is not breathless isn't taking in more oxygen. They just don't feel they need to breathe, take in the next breath as frequently. For people who are breathless, that is scary. When I first started, I'd breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. And I consciously did it. I had to actually learn how to use my diaphragm correctly, which we're not going to go in today. As I worked with the Buteco skills, and I have a previous video on an informal research that you can participate in, which you can do the first of the Buteco skills, which is unblock the nose, because air comes in here, air goes out here. And if we have constrictions up here, then it's going to be harder for us to breathe, and we will feel more breathless. We have a stuffy nose. That's a symptom in COVID, stuffy nose. And I also talk about box breathing. It's another method. It's not Buteco, but it's a method in which you breathe in for whatever you choose, hold your breath for the same amount, breathe out for the same amount, hold your breath for the same amount. And you can look on YouTube, find box breathing. Humming, nitric oxide production. Put the tongue to your roof of your mouth and hum so you feel a vibration. There's YouTube videos about the humming and production and distribution of nitric oxide and how that benefits, how that helps us and helps us develop a good parasympathetic nervous system which calms us down, calms our body down, helps our body heal, helps our body not be so reactive, helps us not have such an autoimmune reaction to everything so that we get jacked up all the time. So what's the conclusion of all of this? It's really important if you have COVID breathlessness that you learn and do and implement some simple breathing skills. Buteco's one of them. There are lots of breathing skills, methods, but you want to pick methods specifically that are calming you down. It can be meditation breathing, it can be box breathing, it can be Buteco. Things like Wim Hof, which you'll hear about, that's not its purpose, so don't use that. You have to be breathless throughout life and as you're moving faster. That's really the ideal, but I can't tell you what your goal is. I knew what my goal was. I didn't want to be breathless as I increased my metabolic need, and it has improved my swimming tremendously. I didn't have any difficulty swimming a lap, 25 meters. I breathed every third stroke. Now I can slowly exhale for 30 strokes and swim 2 to 4 kilometers, easily and relaxed. Biking has changed. Running hasn't improved as much, but I had to change how I ran. I started to use chi running as how I moved my body through space, and that helped as well. The first place to start is to try to just breathe in and out your nose more, and to try to breathe more from the lower part of your lungs. All of you that are breathing up here, this is the smallest part of your lungs, the most inefficient. Everything below the nipple line is the more effective part of your lungs. So how do you make that change? Just put your hand on your belly, on your tummy, and feel it rise and fall. If you feel it here as well, just mentally begin to make that change and relax in your belly. Every time you relax, every time you slow down, calm down, you're activating your parasympathetic nervous system. Our goals in recovering from COVID is to increase how much time we're there. The way I've said it in other videos is you're trying to decrease the intensity of these jacked up episodes, whatever they are, decrease how long they're lasting, and increase the space in between. When you can just go through life like this, rather than like this. So, what's the takeaway? No, 100% oxygen on your meter does not mean you're breathing well. It means that you're looking at something as though that is a goal. And what that does is every time it goes down from that goal, you panic. And when you panic, you're in the sympathetic nervous system. Your mind is activating that. Your body's not activating it. Your body could be unconscious and not breathing for 4 to 5 minutes without brain damage. You need to have that as a baseline for understanding what you're doing. Learn some skills. Meditation, humming, brainwave, calm yourself down. You can calm your breathing down and develop a greater CO2 tolerance. You won't feel you need to breathe in as rapidly. You'll be using your diaphragm. You'll be producing and distributing nitric oxide and opening up your blood vessels to all parts of your body, all your tissues, all your organs. Your hands get warmer. Your feet get warmer. Your chest gets warmer. You feel calmer. The question is how are you going to go back and be the way you were? And you were jacked up, juggling everything person in the sympathetic nervous system. That's not really what you want. You want to live a life that is calmer. You can still do as much. You just do it in a more calm manner. And you recognize that that's preferable. Thank you for listening to me today, and I hope this has helped.